Well, it's our pleasure to be here today in the home of Gale and Kathy Thompson in beautiful Bainbridge Island, Washington. And we're going to interview Dr. Gale Thompson, who was the ASRA president in 1992 to 93. And I had a few background questions to ask you, Gale.
Sure.
First of all, where did you develop this interest in regional anesthesia?
Well, in Vietnam, I would have to say, but it intrigued me even during residency at Walter Reed, where I was for 3 years before going to Vietnam. But it certainly got emphasized in the military surgical situations that I encountered there in a MASH hospital. I was in Vietnam from 1965 to 66. I wrote a brief summary of my time in Vietnam. Maybe you could just hand me that blue folder, which at that point I think was the first article to be written describing anesthesia for battle casualties in Vietnam. So this was published in JAMA in 1967, August 14. And this summarized a routine MASH hospital's processing through the world of anesthesia as we encountered casualties of various kinds. Obviously, you can't use regional anesthesia in all kinds of battle casualties, but whenever possible, I pursued it even further. And from that point, it kind of grew in other ways.
And your career was primarily at Virginia Mason Medical Center. How did you wind up at Virginia Mason?
Well, again, I had this interest in regional anesthesia, and Seattle, on the other hand, was my hometown. So having served time in Vietnam and payback time for my training at Walter Reed, my time to either stay in the Army or get out was upon me. So I came to Virginia Mason, which my reading showed me seemed to be the epicenter of regional anesthesia in Seattle, if not across the country.
Now, you said that you were at the meeting where the original ASRA was formed, and you're actually one of the few people who can recollect that meeting. Can you tell us what happened? How ASRA as an association was formed?
Okay, one has to be careful about saying it was the original ASRA because, as you well know, everybody knows there was a brief period at which the original ASRA was promoted and formed largely through the efforts of Dr. Labat back in 1923. On the other hand, in October of 1975, the founding fathers of ASRA formed the first meeting. I was at that meeting. I can distinctly recall a group of people gathering somewhat like a herd of sheep, all of us kind of lost and wondering what in the world was going to happen next. But on the other hand, the original administrator of ASRA, a guy named John Hinckley, was over in one corner of the room signing up people one by one to become members of ASRA. Don Breidenbaugh, one of my partners at Virginia Mason, urged me to go over and become an early member of ASRA. So I hustled across the room, and as I approached the desk, I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be number 007, because that would have been my next place in line. On the other hand, all of a sudden I found that I was kind of pushed aside, and Jordan Katz, who was one of the original founding fathers, had one of his best people sign up before me. So I got pushed to number 008, but I've often wished that I could have been 007.
So at that time, did the members that were gathered there, did they feel this connection to Labat and this association that he formed in 1923?
I doubt there were more than 5 people in the whole audience who knew who Labat was or about the previous edition of ASRA.
So tell us a little bit about your path to president of ASRA. How did you wind up being president? What were the steps?
Well, again, I worked in a hotbed of regional anesthesia at Virginia Mason. Worked very closely with Dan Moore and Don Breidenbaugh. And we often had visitors from other places who came to see what in the world was different. Dan, of course, was a real character in his way of demonstration, but on the other hand, he was always enthusiastic about some form or any form of regional anesthesia. I'm working in that atmosphere every day and talking with all the visitors who would come. For instance, Alan Winnie became a close friend through a relation, just going to meetings and seeing Alan, and of course all of the other founding fathers were close to my acquaintance. After all, if you're 008, you aren't that far out of 007. So anyway, I just got to know a lot of people and continued my pursuit, being on various committees, and eventually somehow ended up as the Labat Award winner in 1992, as you say.
So, well, when you were president, I don't know if you can remember, what were the issues in ASRA? Do you remember any specific things that needed to be addressed at the time?
Good question. Here, for instance, is the ASRA News for 1992 with my presidential remarks, my presidential message. This was not my Labat message, but it begins talking about how Steve Abram, who later became an ASRA president, Steve and I were attending a meeting in Washington, D.C. of the FDA Committee on Anesthetic Drugs and Techniques. And it was something that happened because there was this almost sudden awareness that chlorprocaine could be possibly toxic. And the FDA had made some proclamations about who should and how should people use chlorprocaine with catheters. And Steve and I were there to pursue it, to seek why the FDA made the decisions they did, and to give them input from ASRA as to the thinking of anesthesiologists.
Did this have to do with the microspinal catheters?
That's correct.
As well?
Yeah.
So during your time as ASRA president, what kind of specific challenges did you come up against? Can you recall?
Well, there are numerous tentacles going out from ASRA by people who showed interest in a lot of different things, but the whole world of pain treatment, pain committees, pain organizations was blossoming like fury. And so ASRA, which had initially began as the Society of Regional Anesthesia, added the terms pain management, regional anesthesia, and pain management. And that was taking up a lot of time and space and interest in that year, for instance. On the other hand, we were forming societies with many of the other countries of the world. I think that eventually grew to be 66 different countries, but especially with the European Society of Regional Anesthesia and the Asian Oceanic Society and the South American Society. I attended meetings in each of those places, and the combination of them seeking help from ASRA or seeking advice, counsel, or just sharing what was going on were some of the major issues. So
what would you account as your major accomplishment during that year as president?
Well, I'm not sure it took place at that 1 year, but one thing that I'll give you two stories. One thing that I'm particularly proud of is that I maintained a relationship with the U.S. Army, especially at Walter Reed, where Colonel Buchenmeyer had pulled together a lot of people to form the Regional Anesthesia Initiative. That organization, for instance, here's a brochure from the meeting of the year 2010, and it was this desire to promote regional anesthesia for the treatment of pain and surgery in battle casualties. I was a speaker at this organization, I believe, for 8 or 9 years in a row. And it was with a sense of payback, I guess, if you will, for the training that I had at Walter Reed when I was a resident. So I'm particularly proud of that. Let me get one other very brief aspect, and that has to do with the formation of ASP, A-S-P. Now, ASP was formed mostly by the getting together of Alan Whitney and Gale Thompson to form this meeting at which poetry would be shared by members of the organization. And it existed for 3 years, although it eventually failed. But I had such a wonderful time sharing poetry with many members of the American Society of Regional Anesthesia. Alan Whitney, for instance, was, well, he wrote a book of poems eventually. He was, loved to read poems by E.E. Cummings, E.E. with a small type, but he read many other many other poems as well. And it's surprising how many people in ASRA showed an interest in pursuing this sort of separate little meeting which occurred on one of the evenings of an annual ASRA meeting. Some of the rhymes I can't repeat, wouldn't be proper here, but the kinds of poems which people shared at the first meeting of the ASP. I believe that Alan and I called it ASP because we thought, well, if it's good for Cleopatra to get bitten by an asp, it'd be good for ASRA to get bitten by an asp. But just a brief list. Phil Breidenbaugh shared poems by Ogden Nash, one called The Ant, one called The Tortoise. Kathy Thompson now shared Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. Gale Thompson shared a poem by Emily Dickinson called Experience. And Alan Whitney shared a poem called Gosh, Dad. And then Gale Thompson again shared To an Athlete Dying Young. Those are just some samples of the kinds of poems that would come out of people. Phil Bromwich, with his distinctive British accent, had a poem about a young mathematician named Hall. I can't repeat the rest of it, but anyway, it was a rhyme.
Do you have a favorite poet yourself?
You know, recently I still read poetry and I still memorize poetry. I'm currently memorizing one called Koodle, Kuoodle. Koodle is a dog, and he senses that people don't know how to smell. You don't really have any good smell left in you. Just if you're a dog, then you know how to smell. So he's talking to his other friend who's a dog. Wonderful little poem with so much expression about how to look at the world through a dog's, I'd say eyes, but really through a dog's nose. But that's an example right now.
Yeah, you've actually won some recognition for your arts in the anesthesia world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the ASA used to have an art exhibit space, and they would accept various kinds of artistic endeavor, some of it classic paintings, photography, but there was one section that had poetry, so original poems were presented. I think I'm as proud about my ribbons that I won for my poems as I am anything else that I've accomplished in the world of anesthesiology.
So when you had issues to address in the ASRA world, who would you call? Who would you lean on professionally?
Well, there are a lot of people within my own hospital who were avid members of ASRA. Of course, Dan Moore and Don Breidenbaugh were maybe the oldest members of that society, but I could talk to Joe Neal, to Mike Mulroy, Manny Batra, many people from the University of Washington staff who weren't as interested in regional anesthesia as we were, but it was nice to get the perspective of guys like Tom Hornbind and some of the other staff members at the university. And then, of course, I had developed a lot of friends around the countryside. I would talk with Alan Winnie frequently, and we became really good friends. In some senses, each of us a foil to the other one, but we developed a really great friendship. Always loved to see him and push him around in his wheelchair.
Were there any particular changes in ASRA that you tended to foster? Things that you wanted to see done differently at the time?
Well, I thought the promotion of pain management was a really good move, that we needed to emphasize pain management as much as regional anesthesia. There were things that were happening that I also did not like, such as the development of much of the technology that seems to rule the world of regional anesthesia today. For example, nerve stimulators, catheters. Those are things that I used, but I depended so much upon my sense of touch, my perception of the tissues and the patient to whom I was addressing my needles. I came to dislike the emphasis upon technology. Of course, I can't use a cell phone even today. Well, that's not quite true. But it happened at the end of my career that technology seemed to rule the world.
So what do you think people are missing out on if they don't know anything other than the technology in their careers?
Well, I think you got to think like a nerve. If you want to make that nerve go to sleep, and appreciate that it's a very sensitive structure, and therefore you use you use your hands and your sense of passage of the needle and use a multiple deposit kind of solution or injection of your solution if you're going to bathe a nerve in and sometimes in, but especially around the nerve where you deposit your load of local anesthetic. I just think the sensitivity to anatomy has taken a back road to a sensitivity to technology.
So do you have a favorite block that you liked more than most?
Well, yes, I'd love to talk with Alan Winnie about his concept of a sheath block versus my technique of axillary block, which had to do with deposition of little bits of local anesthetic in and around a nerve with a short 25 gauge needle.
So how did your department respond to the time and energy commitments that you had to commit to ASRA when you were in the governance of this body?
Well, many of the other members of the department were climbing the same ladder as I was, and there's always backbiting to some degree in departments for one reason or another. I don't know, as humans, we tend to be prone to jealousy or to antagonisms many times, which I don't think are warranted. But on the other hand, when you're intent on being the head of the residency review committee or being president of ASRA or serving in some capacity in the Academy of Anesthesia or other anesthesia organizations, like the writing and editing of questions for the annual exams, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and you will find that people will say, why don't you just go fishing and work more?
So what words would you use to describe ASRA as an organization? What would be your words?
Well, that's a good question. My words, first thought is, it's amazing how it is so close to the word ASRA, the pharmaceutical company, of course, from which we derived lidocaine or xylocaine and marcaine, a company that has really fostered the local anesthetic development. And there have been close relationships with that society between ASRA and ASTRA, but it's certainly not the only company that's been associated with ASRA. I don't know, in terms of other terms, what ASRA means to me is just this tendency to be able to do a nerve block if it can fit the situation in any way, shape, or form. I think it always is a cheap way to buy good anesthesia with prolonged pain relief after the surgery is over.
Do you think that this reliance on technology and maybe longer acting local anesthetics like liposomal bupivacaine, do you think they sort of are contrary to this idea of doing things simply and inexpensively?
Well, perhaps it arises from my time in Vietnam, when you don't have time, nor could you even possibly do it, but you don't have time to have somebody go down the hall and find the latest nerve stimulator machine or or other bit of technology. So I loved, and still do, if I were doing anesthesia. At age 87, I'm not going to do anesthesia anymore, but it took away so much. If you're in a disaster situation, if you're in a war situation, if you're in situations where there's an earthquake or a tidal wave or whatever have you, and you need to provide pain relief to people, chances are you can really do an awful lot with just some form of regional anesthesia. And it's just you and a syringe and a needle and a bottle of local anesthetic drug.
So what advice would you have for the current ASRA presidents and officers?
Well, keep going. Keep pushing the frontiers, but try not to make it too ridiculous in terms of the amount of equipment and help that you might want to use on a daily basis. Think of yourselves as being in Iceland when the volcano ruptures and you've got a lot of people in pain, and yet you still do have simple things like a syringe and a needle and a bottle of local anesthetic drug.
So do you have certain philosophies as far as teaching regional anesthesia to residents?
Yeah, I wrote an article along with one of our residents named Sue McDonald, and I like the thought that we developed in the title of that article. You may have heard the scene, see one, do one, teach one. That's what a lot of people used to say about regional anesthesia. See one, do one, teach one. But what we pulled together was a group of like 70 or 80 anesthesia residents who had had regional anesthesia performed on themselves. And so we changed it from see one, do one, have one. I like that philosophy. It'd do us all good to be on the receiving end of the needle sometimes.
So you had some things that you were going to share with us, some supplies.
Well, I probably have shared most of them. I do have, for example, once when I was early in my career, and I went to the Mayo Clinic as a visiting professor, I came away with Labat needle. Now Labat, back in the original ASRA, had a needle which is shaped like this. This is an original Labat needle, and one of the staff at Mayo Clinic, where Labat had served some time, said, well, we've got some extra needles, I'll give you one. I just accepted it and snuck out.
It doesn't look like the lure adapter would fit on the end of that.
Yeah, but it does.
It's a spinal,
yeah,
a spinal needle.
Yeah, and so you can fit the stylet in. I don't know why Labat chose this particular shape, but this is a Labat needle in its original form. I have a whole boxes of a collection of needles that I put together a couple of times in an exhibit, but you know, if I live another 87 years, I'll probably get them put together here. If anybody has an avid interest and a real interest in regional anesthesia, needles or syringes or drugs, I might be interested in talking. So this is a Labat needle. Now here is a needle, you see it's kind of bent, wavering in its length. This is a malleable needle, many times used for what was called a lemon continuous technique, whereby you put the needle in and then you could bend it up and tape it to the back, and they used holes in the mattress to keep the needle in place while the continuous epidural was played out. There are all kinds of needles with little wings like this, for instance. Gertie Marks, one of the anesthesiologists in New York, had one of those kind of needles with some bent wings. This is more of a flying nun kind of holder, I guess. And then there are all kinds of techniques like epidural balloons. The balloon has deteriorated, But this would have a little balloon, you could put a little pressure in it, and then when you pushed into the epidural space, the balloon would collapse. Various techniques, and there still are 100 of those. These are a group of introducers that different kinds of introducers with different names devised by different authors, which are used to make the initial hole through which you would then pass the spinal needle or the epidural needle. The whole world of equipment intrigues me. Of course, if I were to be in practice today, I'd probably have a table full of X-ray machines and nerve stimulator, of various kinds, and I'd have huge boxes of equipment here instead of just little syringes and needles. But you can do the same job with just these.
Well, it's nice to see that you're still so passionate about this, and I think that was one of the things that made you such a great teacher. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. You're a great resident at the same time. So,
thanks.